When Shaq's plane lands, he expects a new beginning. But instead, he steps into a city that's watching him back. A silent pursuer. A past that refuses to stay buried. And a single photograph that holds all the answers. If he can survive long enough to uncover them. In a world where every step could be a trap, will Shaq dare to walk forward? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The airport terminal buzzed with activity, a controlled chaos of passengers weaving through check-in lines, security checkpoints, and last-minute boarding calls. Shaq moved through it with ease, his broad frame commanding attention as he strode toward his gate. Years of business travel had conditioned him to tune out the commotion, the sea of faces blurring together into an unremarkable backdrop. First class had its privileges. No lines, no waiting, just an effortless glide past the crowd and into the cabin where comfort awaited. The stewardess greeted him with a practiced smile, guiding him to his seat near the window. He nodded in acknowledgement, placing his carry-on in the overhead compartment before settling into the plush leather. Another routine flight. Another city waiting at the other end. He exhaled, preparing for an uneventful trip. But then, from the corner of his eye, he noticed her. A girl, young, maybe in her early 20s, sat beside him, her small frame almost swallowed by the oversized airline seat. Her hands trembled as she gripped an old, slightly crumpled photograph. The edges were worn, the image faded, but whatever it contained, she clung to it like it was a lifeline. Shaq wasn't one to pry. People carried their burdens, and he had learned long ago that most didn't want to share them. Yet there was something about her. The way her breathing quickened. The way her fingers gripped the paper so tightly that her knuckles turned white. That struck a chord deep within him. She was afraid. The engines roared to life, a low vibration humming through the cabin as the flight attendants went through their safety protocols. Shaq adjusted his seatbelt, his mind already moving on. But as the plane began its slow taxi down the runway, the girl's breath hitched. He turned, watching as she pressed the photograph to her chest, her eyes squeezed shut. A deep inhale, a shuddering exhale. Shaq hesitated before speaking. "You all right?" The girl flinched at the sound of his voice. For a moment, she said nothing. Then slowly, she turned toward him, her wide, glassy eyes meeting his. Her voice faltered, barely above a whisper. "I don't know." Something about her answer unsettled him. It wasn't just nerves. There was something deeper there, something raw and frayed at the edges. He could have left it alone, could have given her a polite nod and returned to his own world. But against his better judgment, he found himself asking, "First time flying?" She shook her head. "No." Shaq waited, sensing there was more. The plane picked up speed, the force of acceleration pushing them back into their seats. The girl's grip on the photograph tightened. Her breathing grew unsteady. For a split second, Shaq thought she might actually scream. Then, as the wheels lifted off the ground, she muttered something, so soft, so broken, that he almost missed it. "He doesn't know." Shaq's brow furrowed. "Who?" The girl swallowed, her throat bobbing as she struggled for composure. "My father." There it was. The weight behind her eyes, the tension in her hands. It all made sense now. Shaq leaned back, letting her gather her thoughts. He knew better than to push. Whatever storm she was battling, she would either let him in or she wouldn't. Minutes passed. The plane leveled out, and the seatbelt sign dinged off. Around them, passengers settled into their routines, some adjusting their blankets, others flipping through in-flight magazines. Normalcy resumed, but between Shaq and the girl, the air remained thick with unspoken words. Finally, she exhaled shakily. "I wasn't supposed to be on this flight." Shaq turned to her fully now. "Then why are you?" She hesitated, then placed the photograph face up on her tray table. Shaq glanced at it. The image showed a man in his 40s, smiling, his arm wrapped around a young girl. The resemblance was unmistakable. "My father," she said. "He thinks I'm home. He doesn't know I'm coming." Shaq's gaze flickered between the photo and the girl. "Why not?" She bit her lip. "Because I don't know if I'll make it in time." A heavy pause. Shaq knew that tone. That weight in someone's voice when they were standing on the precipice of something irreversible. The girl looked down, running her finger along the worn edges of the photograph. "He's in the hospital. Stage 4 cancer. I just found out." Shaq felt something stir in his chest. He had been expecting nervousness, maybe a fear of flying. But this was something else entirely. "I haven't seen him in 6 years, she continued. "We fought. I left. I told myself I didn't need him." Her voice wavered. "But now I don't know if I'll even get to say goodbye." Shaq sat in silence, absorbing her words. He understood regret. He understood the ache of lost time. She blinked back tears, gripping the photograph like it was the only thing holding her together. "I don't know if he'll even want to see me." Shaq exhaled. He didn't know this girl, didn't know her story beyond the few words she had just spoken. But in that moment, he saw something familiar, something that reached beyond the boundaries of strangers on a plane. He had been there once. A different story, a different past, but the same fear of not knowing if there was still time to fix what had been broken. And just like that, the flight didn't feel so routine anymore. The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin, a constant, almost hypnotic vibration that blurred the passage of time. Shaq stared out the window, watching the world below disappear into an endless stretch of clouds. He wasn't the type to strike up conversations with strangers, especially not on flights where silence was a luxury. Yet something about the girl sitting beside him, her restless fingers, the subtle tremor in her breath, made it impossible to ignore her presence. She looked young, barely out of her teens, with a fragile demeanor that didn't match the sharp focus in her eyes. The way she curled into herself, arms crossed tight, suggested she was shielding something, whether from herself or the world. Shaq couldn't tell. He wasn't a man who pried, but he knew what it felt like to sit alone with thoughts too heavy to carry. Without turning his head, he spoke. "You okay?" The question hung between them, simple yet loaded. The girl flinched, as if she hadn't expected anyone to notice her unraveling. For a moment, it seemed like she wouldn't answer. Her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve, twisting the fabric into knots. "I'm fine," she said finally, though the tightness in her voice betrayed her words. Shaq didn't push. Silence had a way of coaxing truths better than questions. A long pause followed before she spoke again, this time softer. "It's just a long trip." Shaq glanced at her from the corner of his eye. There was a flicker of something deeper beneath her hesitation. Fear? Guilt? He had seen that look before, in people running from something they couldn't outrun. "You traveling alone?" he asked. She hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Yeah." Her fingers moved to a small bracelet on her wrist, tracing the beads absent-mindedly. A nervous habit, or maybe a reminder. Shaq wasn't sure which. The air between them felt charged now, like a storm waiting to break. Around them, passengers dozed off, flipped through magazines, or scrolled mindlessly through their phones, oblivious to the silent tension unraveling between two strangers. Shaq wasn't one to get involved in other people's problems. He had enough of his own. But something about this girl's demeanor struck a chord in him. The way she avoided eye contact, the way her hands gripped the armrest every time the plane shifted slightly. It wasn't just nervousness. It was something deeper. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "I made a mistake." Shaq's gaze snapped to her, but she wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were locked on the seat in front of her, lost in a memory too heavy to shake. A mistake. Shaq knew better than to ask what kind. Some mistakes could be shrugged off. Others had consequences that chased you down no matter how far you ran. He studied her for a moment before saying, "Everyone does." Her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to say more, but she swallowed it back. The tension in her shoulders didn't ease, but something in her expression shifted. A quiet understanding passed between them. Two people carrying burdens they didn't talk about. Outside, the sky darkened as the plane continued its course, carrying them both toward an uncertain destination. And in that fleeting moment, Shaq realized. This wasn't just another passenger. This girl was running from something. And whatever it wasn't far behind. The plane jolted suddenly, a sharp dip in altitude making the cabin tremble. Overhead compartments rattled. A few passengers gasped, and the seatbelt sign flickered back on with a dull chime. The girl beside Shaq stiffened, gripping the armrests so tightly her knuckles turned white. Shaq barely reacted to the turbulence. He had been through worse, both in the air and on the ground. What unsettled him wasn't the plane. It was the girl. She had been holding herself together barely, but now the cracks were showing. Her breathing quickened. Her eyes darted to the seatbelt sign as if it were a warning more than an instruction. Her hands trembled. She wasn't afraid of flying. This was something else. "You all right?" Shaq asked, keeping his voice even. She didn't answer right away. Her fingers curled into fists before she exhaled sharply, forcing herself to speak. I just hate turbulence," she lied. Shaq wasn't convinced. The turbulence settled just as quickly as it had started, but the unease between them remained. Around them, passengers went back to their books, their in-flight meals, their idle conversations. But for the girl, it was as if the world had just shifted beneath her feet. Then, without looking at him, she whispered something so softly Shaq almost didn't catch it. A name. A name that sent ice through his veins. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "What did you just say?" The girl hesitated, her lips parting as if she regretted speaking at all. But it was too late. Shaq had heard it, and there was no taking it back. She met his gaze for the first time since they had boarded the plane, and what he saw in her eyes made his pulse quicken. Fear. Not the kind that came from turbulence or uneasy flights, but the kind that came from knowing something you weren't supposed to know. Shaq leaned in slightly, his voice low, urgent. "Where did you hear that name?" She swallowed hard. You know him, don't you?" Shaq didn't answer. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said enough. The girl exhaled shakily. "I knew it," she murmured. "I knew I wasn't imagining it. Her voice caught, as if just saying the name again would make something terrible happen. "He's the reason I'm here." Shaq's jaw clenched. He hadn't heard that name in years, and he had hoped he never would again. But here it was, resurfacing in the most unexpected of places. Spoken by a girl who, by all accounts, shouldn't have had any connection to his past. He studied her, his mind racing through possibilities. Coincidence? Unlikely. He didn't believe in those anymore. "Tell me everything," he said. The girl hesitated, glancing around the cabin, as if expecting someone to be listening. "We shouldn't talk here," she whispered. Shaq's instincts screamed at him. Whatever she was running from, whatever she knew, it was big enough to make her afraid of even speaking about it in public. And if this name, that name, had anything to do with it, then Shaq knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just her problem anymore. It was his. Shaq kept his gaze locked on the girl, waiting. But the moment had passed. The fear that had momentarily pushed her to speak had now pulled her back into silence. She looked away, shoulders tense, lips pressed together in regret. She wished she hadn't said anything. The plane's soft rumble filled the silence between them. The hum of passengers lost in their own worlds, the occasional ding of a service call button, the low murmur of flight attendants moving down the aisle. It all blurred into background noise. In the foreground, only her breathing mattered. Quick, shallow, uncertain. Shaq leaned back slightly, giving her space but not letting the moment slip completely. "I know that name for a reason," he said, his voice steady, controlled. "And I don't believe in coincidences. If you're in trouble, you need to tell me." The girl shook her head almost immediately. "It's nothing," she muttered, her fingers tightening around something in her lap. He hadn't noticed it before, but now he saw it clearly. A small, creased photograph, edges frayed from too much handling. She was holding onto it like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Shaq didn't press further. Not yet. He knew what it was like to hold onto something too painful to speak aloud. His fingers instinctively brushed over his jacket pocket, feeling the outline of his own photograph. A reminder. A wound that never quite healed. And just like that, he was no longer in the airplane cabin. The past had come knocking. The alley smelled of rain and regret. Dim streetlights flickered above, casting uneven shadows on the damp pavement. Shaq's boots splashed through shallow puddles as he walked, his mind heavy, his body even heavier. He was leaving. Leaving behind the streets that had shaped him, the people who had betrayed him, the ghosts that refused to let go. But some things didn't stay in the past. Some things followed, no matter how fast you ran. "Shaq, don't do this." He turned. The voice was familiar. Too familiar. A mixture of anger and desperation laced with something else. Something close to fear. The man standing a few feet away was someone Shaq had once trusted. Once. "It's over," Shaq said, keeping his voice level. "I'm done." The man shook his head, laughing bitterly. "No, you're not. You don't just walk away from something like this. You know that." Shaq clenched his jaw. He had been ready for this conversation, but now that it was happening, it felt different. He wasn't afraid. He was tired. "You're making a mistake," the man continued. "And if you leave now, you'll regret it." Shaq exhaled slowly, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. "I already regret everything." The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, the name. Spoken so casually, so carelessly, as if it were just another word in an endless string of threats. Shaq felt something inside him snap. He didn't say another word, he just turned and walked away. It was the last time he saw that man. The last time he allowed himself to care. Shaq blinked, the airplane cabin snapping back into focus. The past faded, but it left its mark, like an old scar aching in the cold. The girl was still clutching the photograph, still avoiding his eyes. He understood her silence now. She wasn't ready to talk. He looked down at his own hands. He had been in her position before, carrying the weight of something too painful to share. And he knew that pushing her would only make her retreat further. So instead, he sat back, giving her the time she needed. A few minutes passed before she finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper. I just want to get away." Shaq nodded, though they both knew running never truly freed you. The tension between them remained, unspoken yet heavy. Whatever truth she was hiding, it wasn't just hers. Somehow it was tied to him. And whether he liked it or not, he was already involved. The weight of the past had a way of pulling you back in. And Shaq had just taken his first step toward a story he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. Shaq had faced a lot in his life. Deals gone south, betrayals, moments where everything he built nearly collapsed. But nothing had ever made his heart pound the way this girl's words just did. "I know who you are, Shaq, and I know what you did." The cabin noise faded into nothing. The chatter of passengers, the hum of the engines, even the occasional ding of the seatbelt sign, all of it blurred into the background. Shaq's fingers curled slightly against the armrest. His breath came out slow, controlled, too controlled. He had spent years training himself not to react, not to let anything get to him. But this was different. His gaze locked onto hers, searching. What did she mean? What exactly did she think she knew? "Excuse me?" His voice was low, measured. The girl didn't flinch. If anything, she looked even more certain. The photograph in her lap trembled slightly in her grasp, but her eyes didn't waver. "I know," she said, voice steady despite the emotion in her throat, "that my father's life changed the day he met you." Shaq's chest tightened. The weight of those words pressed down like a vice, squeezing the air from his lungs. Father. A storm of thoughts crashed through him at once, fragments of memories flashing like flickering lights. Number it couldn't be. His voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. "Who's your father?" She lifted the photograph slightly, letting the dim cabin lights illuminate the face in the picture. Shaq's world lurched. The face staring back at him was one he hadn't seen in years. A face he had buried in the past, locked away with every other mistake he had sworn never to revisit. His pulse thundered in his ears. His mouth went dry. "That's not possible," he muttered, but the words felt weak, empty. It was possible. And deep down, he already knew it was true. The girl watched him carefully, her expression unreadable. But her eyes held something heavy, something close to heartbreak. "He told me about you," she said. "About how meeting you was the best and worst thing that ever happened to him." Shaq's stomach twisted painfully. He forced himself to look at the picture again, at the eyes that stared back at him from the worn-out photograph. Memories he thought he had left behind clawed their way to the surface. A voice from the past, a decision that had led them both down paths neither of them could escape. And now, sitting beside him, was the daughter of the man he had tried so hard to forget. His past had finally caught up to him, and for the first time in his life, Shaq had no idea what to do next. The plane lurched suddenly, tilting just enough to send a ripple of unease through the cabin. Overhead bins creaked, and a few passengers let out startled gasps. The seatbelt sign flickered back on, followed by a calm but firm voice over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has turned on the seatbelt sign due to unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." A flight attendant near the aisle tightened her grip on a drink cart, her usually practiced effortless movements momentarily faltering. The murmur of conversation among passengers grew sharper, more anxious, but Shaq hardly heard any of it. His mind was still stuck on the girl's words. "I know who you are, Shaq. And I know what you did." He hadn't been able to breathe right since. Outside, the skies churned with turbulence. Inside, so did he. The girl sitting beside him wasn't reacting to the shaking plane the way others were. She wasn't gasping, gripping her seat, or muttering reassurances to herself. Instead, she sat unnaturally still, her fingers digging into the armrests, her breath shallow. Shaq stole a glance at her, noticing the stiffness in her posture, the way her shoulders curled inward, as if she were trying to make herself smaller. Then, she squeezed her eyes shut. Shaq exhaled slowly. "You okay?" She didn't answer right away. Then, after a long pause, she whispered, "I hate turbulence." Her voice was tight, her knuckles white against the armrest. "It'll pass," Shaq muttered, keeping his voice even. She let out a breathless, humorless chuckle. "That's what I thought about my life, too." Shaq froze, caught off guard. She wasn't talking about the plane anymore. His gaze shifted to her face, really taking her in this time. There was exhaustion in her eyes, something much deeper than just fear of flying. It was the exhaustion of someone carrying a weight they weren't built to bear. Another jolt rocked the aircraft, this one sharper, more aggressive. A few rows ahead, a woman let out a small yelp, clutching her husband's arm. A businessman across the aisle muttered a curse, his grip tightening around his tablet. Shaq barely noticed. The girl was shaking now, just slightly, her lips pressed into a firm line. She turned her head toward him, her voice lower this time. "I need to tell you something." Shaq felt his chest tighten. He knew this moment was coming. He had felt it hanging between them since the moment she sat down. But now that it was here, he wasn't sure if he was ready. "What is it?" His voice came out rougher than he intended. She hesitated. Her hands, which had been gripping the seat so tightly, slowly released their hold. Then, she whispered the words that made Shaq's entire body go cold. "My father knew you, Shaq. And because of you, his life was never the same." The words sent a jolt through him stronger than any turbulence could. For a moment, he thought he misheard her. Then she pulled out the photograph. A small, worn-out picture. The edges were frayed, the ink slightly faded from time, but the face staring back at Shaq was clear as day, and his heart stopped. His mind fought against it, tried to reject what he was seeing, but the past was staring him in the face, forcing its way back in. Shaq's breath shuddered out of him. He knew this man. He knew him too well. And in an instant, everything changed. The turbulence outside was growing stronger, but inside Shaq, a different kind of storm was raging. He forced himself to swallow the lump in his throat, his voice hoarse when he finally spoke. Who is your father?" The girl's grip on the photograph tightened, her knuckles trembling slightly. "You already know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Shaq's stomach dropped. The pieces were clicking into place too fast, too painfully. The name he had spent years trying to forget was now sitting beside him in the form of this girl. Shaq started, but his throat closed around the words. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "You're telling me," he exhaled slowly, "that he was your father?" She nodded. A fresh wave of turbulence hit, causing the plane to jerk violently to the side. Passengers gasped in alarm. A flight attendant stumbled slightly, grabbing onto a seat for support. But all Shaq could hear was the deafening pound of his own heartbeat. Shaq had spent years burying his past, locking it away in places no one could reach. But now, this girl was sitting beside him, a living, breathing reminder of everything he thought he had escaped. He wanted to deny it, to say she was wrong. But the photograph in her hand told the truth he wasn't ready to face. Shaq let out a slow breath. He never told me he had a daughter. The girl swallowed, her hands tightening into fists on her lap. He never got the chance to. Something sharp and ugly twisted inside Shaq's chest. The plane lurched again, and the captain's voice came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing heavier turbulence than expected. Please remain in your seats and keep your seatbelts fastened." But Shaq barely heard it. His entire world had already been shaken. His past had finally caught up to him, and now, for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if he was strong enough to face it. 7A flight of reckoning. The cabin had gone eerily still. Not in reality, of course. The engines still hummed. The occasional murmur of passengers floated through the aisles, and the fasten seatbelt sign blinked overhead. But in Shaq's mind, everything had stopped. The past, the present, and the impossible truth sitting right beside him had all collapsed into one single moment. He could still feel the weight of her words. "My father knew you, Shaq. And because of you, his life was never the same." Shaq's fingers twitched against his knee, his throat tight. He was a man who had spent his entire life controlling his emotions, keeping them locked away behind walls so high that no one, not even himself, could climb over them. But now he was staring at the cracks in those walls, feeling them widen under the pressure of a truth he hadn't been prepared to face. Across from him, the girl sat rigid, her grip on the old photograph in her hands tightening. She hadn't spoken since her revelation, and yet her presence alone was enough to pull him under. Then, with a quiet inhale, she did what Shaq wasn't sure he was ready for. She handed him the photograph. Shaq hesitated. His hands, usually so steady, so sure, felt strangely heavy as he reached forward. The moment his fingertips brushed the worn edges of the paper, something cold coiled in his chest. He forced himself to look down, and then his breath left him all at once. It wasn't just a photograph, it was a ghost. A fragment of a life he had long buried, an image that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken regrets. The man in the picture stared back at him, frozen in time, unaware that one day this very photo would rip open wounds Shaq had never let heal. His heart pounded, the sound loud and hollow in his ears. The past clawed at him, memories resurfacing like a tide he couldn't hold back. "It can't be," he muttered. Though even as the words left his lips, he knew they were a lie. It could be. It was. The girl was still watching him. Not with triumph, not with anger, but with something deeper. Something achingly raw. "I was hoping," she said quietly, "that you'd remember him." Shaq swallowed hard. "I never forgot." His voice was hoarse, almost foreign to his own ears. She nodded, as if she had expected that answer, but the pain in her expression didn't fade. "Then why didn't you ever come back?" The question hit him harder than any punch ever could. He didn't have an answer. Or maybe he did, but it wasn't one he was ready to say out loud. So he did what he always did. He stayed silent. But silence, he quickly realized, wouldn't save him this time. The plane rumbled beneath them again, another wave of turbulence rolling through the cabin. The passengers around them barely noticed now, too accustomed to the shaky flight. Shaq, however, felt like the ground beneath him had disappeared entirely. The girl took a slow, steady breath. Then, she asked the question he had been dreading since the moment this conversation began. "Are you ready to make it right?" The words sat between them like a live wire, electric and dangerous. Shaq didn't move, didn't breathe, because he didn't know the answer. He had spent years pretending the past didn't exist, that the choices he had made were just that, choices, not chains. But now, faced with the very person whose life had been shaped by those choices, he was forced to wonder if he had been lying to himself all along. He looked down at the photograph again, the familiar face, the past he couldn't outrun. And for the first time in his life, Big Shaq didn't know what to do next. The pilot's voice echoed through the cabin, steady and calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for landing." For most passengers, this was just another routine flight coming to an end. Conversations resumed, seatbelts clicked into place, and the distant hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane began its slow descent toward the city lights below. But for Big Shaq, this flight had changed everything. He sat stiffly in his seat, staring down at the old photograph still clutched in his hands. The worn edges felt rough beneath his fingertips, as if time itself had tried to erase the past, but never quite succeeded. Beside him, the girl was silent, watching, waiting. She had already said what she needed to say. She had handed him the truth. Now it was his choice what to do with it. Shaq exhaled slowly, his thoughts a chaotic mess. He had been here before, at a crossroads, a choice between walking away or facing what he'd been running from his entire life. And if there was one thing Shaq had always been good at, it was running. Outside the window, the city lights flickered, growing larger as the plane lowered through the clouds. Shaq's grip on the photograph tightened. Memories clawed at him, memories he had long since buried. The day he walked away, the silence he left behind, the choices he made that led him here. His chest felt tight, suffocated by the weight of regret. For so long he had told himself it didn't matter, that the past was the past, and he had built a life without looking back. But now, staring at the girl beside him, the daughter of the man whose life he had once changed, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Guilt, not just the kind that lingers in the back of your mind, but the kind that consumes you whole, pressing down until you can't breathe. The girl shifted beside him, her fingers fidgeting slightly. Despite her earlier determination, there was fear in her eyes. Fear that he would make the same choice he made all those years ago, that he would walk away again. Shaq closed his eyes briefly, inhaling sharply. Could he? Could he really just walk off this plane, disappear into the city, and pretend this never happened? Could he live with himself if he did? The landing gear rumbled, and the aircraft jolted slightly as it prepared for final descent. Shaq barely noticed, because suddenly, the girl beside him did something that made his breath catch in his throat. She extended her hand, not forcefully, not desperately, just quietly, fingers outstretched between them, as if offering something bigger than just a handshake. A choice. A second chance. Shaq stared at it. It was such a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of everything he had been avoiding. This wasn't just about a conversation. This wasn't just about the past. This was about redemption, about righting a wrong. He swallowed hard, his pulse thudding against his ribs. It would be easy to walk away, easier than staying. But for the first time in his life, Shaq didn't want the easy way out. The plane touched down with a smooth, controlled landing. A few passengers clapped, relieved to be back on solid ground. The tension of the flight began to dissolve for everyone else. But for Shaq, this wasn't the end. This was the beginning of something he hadn't been ready for, until now. He inhaled deeply, staring down at the outstretched hand beside him. And then, slowly, he reached out. Fingers brushed against fingers, and in that moment, something shifted. This flight had never been about just reaching his destination. It had been about finding the courage to stop running. And as he clasped her hand firmly, Shaq knew one thing for certain. He wasn't walking away this time. The plane's wheels kissed the runway with a firm jolt, rattling Shaq's nerves as much as the metal frame of the aircraft. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself as the roaring engines decelerated. His fingers twitched against the armrest, his muscles stiff from the long flight. The hum of seatbelts unbuckling filled the cabin as passengers around him began gathering their belongings. Beside him, the girl stretched her arms slightly, rolling her shoulders. Her expression was calmer now, lighter, though the exhaustion still clung to her eyes. The silent storm she had been carrying seemed to have settled. For now. She turned to him and smiled faintly. "Thank you." The words were simple, but something in her voice made them feel heavier. Shaq acknowledged them with a nod, not trusting himself to speak. He wasn't sure he had done enough to deserve gratitude, but he had done what he could. As he stood, his fingers brushed against his jacket pocket, feeling the worn edges of the photograph tucked inside. He pulled it out, letting his eyes linger on the familiar face. It was more than just a picture. It was a reminder, a tether to the past, a promise unfulfilled. He swallowed hard. He knew what he had to do next. The moment he stepped off the plane, the air felt different, thicker, charged with the energy of the unknown. The airport was alive with movement, an endless stream of strangers, each wrapped in their own stories, their own journeys. The sounds of rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, and distant announcements created a disorienting symphony. Shaq's gaze swept the area, his instincts kicking in. He had spent too much of his life reading rooms, assessing threats, preparing for the unexpected. Old habits died hard. As they approached the immigration counter, he noticed the girl fidgeting with her passport, her grip tight around it. She wasn't used to this, to crossing borders with uncertainty. He wanted to reassure her, but before he could, the officer called her forward. She hesitated for half a second, then stepped up. Her interview was brief. A stamp on the passport, a nod from the officer, and she was through. Shaq's turn. He slid his passport across the counter. The officer barely looked up as he flipped through the pages, then thumped the stamp onto the visa with finality. "Welcome," the officer said without emotion, sliding the document back. Shaq muttered a thanks and walked through. The airport's arrival hall was a blur of people waiting for loved ones, taxi drivers holding up placards, and tourists checking maps. He had no welcoming party, no sign with his name. He was on his own. Then, something tugged at his awareness. A presence. Someone was watching him. Shaq didn't turn his head right away. Instead, he adjusted the strap of his bag, using the motion to discreetly scan the crowd. A man, standing near the exit, was looking in his direction. Not directly at him, but close enough. The kind of gaze that wasn't meant to be noticed. Shaq started walking, slow and deliberate. He didn't rush, didn't give anything away. The key to shaking a tail was to act natural, unpredictable. As he stepped outside, the city swallowed him whole. The honking of impatient drivers, the shouts of street vendors, the distant rumble of life carrying on. He moved with purpose, letting the flow of the crowd pull him forward. A glance at his reflection in a shop window confirmed it. He was still being followed. The man had moved, keeping his distance but staying in sight. Shaq clenched his jaw. This wasn't paranoia. He had been in enough tight situations to recognize the signs. Who was this guy? And more importantly, what did he want? Shaq took a turn down a quieter street, the narrow alleyways offering cover. If this man wanted to follow him, he would have to make a choice, either expose himself or lose his trail. Seconds passed. Then footsteps. Shaq picked up the pace, heart pounding. The photograph in his pocket felt heavier now, a reminder of why he was here, of what was at stake. This was just the beginning. The past had finally caught up with him, and there was no turning back. Shaq's journey is only beginning, but the real question is, what happens next? Will he uncover the truth hidden within the photograph, or will the shadows of his past consume him first? Who's been watching him since he landed, and what do they really want? Don't miss the next chapter of Shaq's gripping mystery. Stay with us as we unravel the secrets, the suspense, and the twists you won't see coming. Follow or subscribe to be the first to know what happens next.